across from this road is a monument dated November 11th, 1918. In French it reads, to the heroic soldiers of France who defended the lands and liberated Alsace and Lorraine. We're at an incredibly significant historical spot. Not just if you look back in the lens of back in the day, but also a significant spot in terms of how our modern world has been shaped. I'm right now in Picardie, in northeastern France. I'm in the Oise department. Picardie, the region, is made up of 3 departments: the Somme, the Aisne, and the Oise. And we're gonna explore all of them. And Picardie, I'm here for 2 reasons. I'm actually also gonna go further north into Nord-Pas-de-Calais. But Picardie, I'm here, and same goes for Nord-Pas-de-Calais, is basically 2 reasons. One is the political climate in France right now is really interesting. Marine Le Pen has probably the most support on the continent in this area of northeastern France, in Haute-de-France as they call it. And I want to talk to the people, see why they believe that Marine Le Pen is their champion. But that is not the subject of the video. The subject of this video is the immense sacrifice that France in particular made in World War I. Now, France didn't lose the most men in World War I, but it mobilized an incredibly high percentage of its population. The Germans, of course, invaded, and much of the fighting was done on French territory. As such, you're defending your homeland. That's what's going to happen, a mass conscription. And we basically see that although the German Empire would collapse, the Russian Empire would collapse, Austro-Hungary would be completely dissolved, the Ottomans would collapse, the French Third Republic, as it was, would continue to exist, horrifically scarred. France would mobilize about 10 million men, maybe a little more. But when your population is just under 40 million, that's an incredible number. And we're here because this is the forest of Compiègne, right next to the town of Compiègne. And for those history buffs who know, Compiègne is where the Armistice was signed. Right there is a museum, but I'm not a big museum guy and we're not going to check it out. Although the actual carriage on which the Armistice was signed is actually in there, but it's not a big deal. And over here we have sort of a plaque. I guess maybe this could be the original train tracks and this could be where it was actually signed, but this says here Le Maréchal Foch, as in Ferdinand Foch. And Ferdinand Foch was Supreme Allied Commander on the Western Front in the final months of World War I. He fought as a general under previous commanders-in-chief throughout the war, starting at the First Battle of the Marne. But towards the end, he was trusted to be at the helm. And over here, my French isn't great, but this says something like along the lines of the criminal German Empire here was put down and people were liberated or something like that. They're using some fancy terms that just I'm not familiar with. Gotta quickly interrupt myself. The stupid Citroen that I rented, its speaker system overheats, and as a result I can't listen to music temporarily, so I got nothing to do. But basically that plaque is not beyond my comprehension. I would find out it's just awkward to read it while holding the camera. And so basically what it says, it was saying how here is where the armistice signing location, Here is where the criminal German entity was vanquished by the free people it tried to enslave. And, if you compared France proper to Germany proper at the time, that's a fair statement. Metropolitan France was a democracy, whereas the Germans, they basically had an authoritarian dictatorship, which is all the empire was, as is all monarchy, just a dictatorship that's hereditary. But basically, it's important to note that France did have an empire, and those colonial people would not, for sure, those subjects wouldn't believe that they're free. So that's just something of note, a little bit of a propaganda trick the French use. But yes, in terms of the proper France proper versus Germany proper, that plaque is certainly it holds. But another interesting side note is that Armistice location is not what it looked like in 1919 after the war. Basically, when Hitler would conquer France, something the German Empire only dreamt of doing, Hitler destroyed the entire site and took the actual carriage, the train that the signing was, that's where the actual armistice was signed, he took it back to Germany. And everything else was blown up, except for the statue of Ferdinand Foch, one of the architects of Germany's demise in the First World War. And so the reason why is Hitler wanted Foch to see what waste he brought to France, what a wasteland it's become because of his war that he waged. And so I thought that was a little bit interesting. All the things you see there right now are rebuilt, and there's only replicas basically nowadays, but it's just an interesting side note. On to the next. And over there we have, as I walk towards it, a statue of the man himself, Ferdinand Foch. And you have to understand the significance of World War I in France. I've been to France many times, and every single tiny town, and I mean tiny, I mean even under 50 people, you go to in France, there's a statue for the martyrs who died. Again, France conscripted a great deal of men, huge percentage of the population. And so this, of course, would spread across the nation, even far-flung Corsica, which I visited in spring of 2023, which has an active separatist movement. Even them, every tiny town, monument to the martyrs who were conscripted and died. Here we have the man himself who helped deliver the final blow, Ferdinand Foch. Impeccable sash. Maybe one day I could get to that point. Well, World War I was really fought for stupid reasons, really more so egos than actual genuine reasons to fight a war, especially of that scale, which had never been seen before at the time. Basically, the Austro-Hungarians had annexed Bosnia about 5 to 8 years prior to the outbreak of the war. And this inflamed not only the whole of Europe, but also specifically the Serb government of Belgrade, and also the Serbs living in Bosnia. And basically, militant cells evolve, and it climaxes into the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in Sarajevo. Well, this sparks the July crisis. Austria-Hungary, under a hawkish command of Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf, him amongst others, issues an ultimatum to the Serbs, designed to be rejected. The Serbs accept all points except for a few. The whole of Europe says accept it. Austria, accept it. Even their ally Germany says accept it. But they do not. They declare war. And Russia, as a result, begins to mobilize their men in support of their Slavic brethren, Serbia. As a result of Russia's mobilization, and German fears that if Russia gets, their military on their way, they'll be unstoppable, Germany launches a preemptive declaration of war on Russia, followed by a preemptive declaration of war on France, who was Russia's ally at the time, So the chain of commands leads to this total war. Eventually, the Germans will invade France through Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality guaranteed by the Treaty of London. And at that point, you have Britain enter the fray. And my God, there's few wars that leave such a scar as the First World War, especially because it wasn't all that long ago. And it's kind of chilling that this is where it all ended. But this is just the start of an epic journey. And I hope that this pays homage to the sacrifices France's people have made for the liberty of the world. I am just west of the city of Château-Thierry. Got a couple donkeys, one there. Beautiful spot I found. And we're right beside the Marne River. Now the Marne River is one of the major sort of rivers that flow through Picardie. The others being the Somme, the Aisne, and the Oise, which we've discussed. But this river, which does have a department, it's east of here, called the Marne Department, which is also Champagne country. This river flows through there, but it also happens to flow through the southeastern bit of Picardie. And it's famous for the Battle of Marne. So remember that in the outbreak of the war, the Germans, using a decentralized command structure where commanders of armies would kind of go on their own initiative, which was not the case for the Allied armies, which would listen to the commands of the Chief of Staff. Well, under that sort of system, the Germans underwent the Schlieffen Plan, which called for the rapid invasion of France, and it would mean that the Russians would be dealt with later. So France would receive the bulk of the German army. They'd be invaded first, knocked out, and then they'd shift the army towards the Russians, which were seen as the greater threat. And we see that during the Battle of the Marne, or right before it, I should say, when the Schlieffen Plan is kind of on its way, the Germans get overstretched, right? The first month of the war is a great success and a disaster for the Western Allies. But as the Germans advance with this decentralized command structures, the armies led by generals kind of veer off on their own, and eventually a gap forms. Well, the British, but mostly the French, it's important to note that the French are conscripting, their whole population, as much people as they can, whereas the British have a volunteer army at this point. Only about 100,000 men at the outbreak of the war, whereas the French are mobilizing millions. And so the British under the command of John French, and the French under Chief of Staff Joseph Joffre, right? So remember, Ferdinand Foch, which we discussed earlier, was towards the end of the war. But in the first 2 years of the war, it was Joseph Joffre who was the Chief of Staff of the French army. They sort of gather and reorganize after disastrous defeats of the first month of the war, and launch a counterattack right into the gap that's forming between von Bülow and von Kluck's two armies. They're kind of at the spearhead. And that sort of counterattack, known as the Battle of the Marne, happened around these areas, actually, right around Château-Thierry, where I'm at. God, it is beautiful country out here. Oh my God, in the sun, I've seen that this is the first time, I'm not even seeing it, but that's the best I'm gonna get this trip. And so what happens is the Germans are forced to retreat. They retreat all the way to the Aisne River. And once they retreat, they're kind of just east of Soissons, which is the city that I actually stayed at last night. And that's where the front line kind of forms for the next 3 years. And it remains that way. And it's just an utter bloodbath. That's when we start getting the human wave attacks that World War I is unfortunately famous for, or infamous for, I should say. And look at the grandeur of the Marne. It is a massive river. Just an absolutely massive river. But yeah, just a short ode to the men who died at the Marne. And quick overview of the opening phases of the war. All right, we're gonna continue heading north. I'm at a site which has seen untold suffering and carnage. When the war broke out in 1914, summer of 1914, the mood was kind of glorious, unbelievably. There was patriotism, nationalism. People were enlisting, excited to fight what they thought would be a quick war. But it was anything but. Basically, the French and their sort of famous pride and frankly ignorance prepared themselves and got into battle by adorning dress from the mid-1800s, stuff that wouldn't be too astray from Napoleonic times. Bright colors, bright red, bright blue, instead of the drab the Germans were wearing, and other armies as well. Drab camouflages. When you're wearing bright colors, you stand out like a sore thumb. And with modern artillery, it could be disastrous. And of course, machine guns. Well, the war breaks out, and the French initiate Plan 17. The so-called Battle of the Frontiers occurs. And in the Battle of the Frontiers, despite all the carnage of the war, we'd see France's single greatest loss of life throughout the entire war. The French would march with their bright uniforms and get cut down to pieces by German machine guns. Literal bayonet charges. These antiquated tactics by proud French officers would see over 300,000 dead. After the Germans initiate the Schlieffen Plan, and after the Battle of the Marne, and the first battle of the Aisne River, when the front line stabilizes, the Allies meet at Chantilly, and they agree to coordinate their offensive. Joseph Joffre organizes the French and British armies, and they plan an offensive for the spring. Well, the Battle of Verdun occurs. The Germans go for Verdun, knowing that France will do anything it can to defend this national treasure and to bleed the French white. Well, it works. The French dedicate all they can to it. And as such, the planned joint offensive would have to be primarily done by the British. And as such, we get this memorial and the ruins of not just one, but many villages. I'm right now at Thiepval. And that Thiepval we see there is not the true Thiepval. This is the new Thiepval. Thiepval is one of dozens of villages that were utterly obliterated in the war because of the Battle of the Somme and other battles, of course. But particular to Thiepval is because of the Battle of the Somme. Basically, the British initiate the attack largely by themselves. The French do support, but the French are occupied at Verdun. The British on the first day would lose 55,000 casualties, almost 20,000 dead, the bloodiest day in all of the British Empire's history. And all that for ultimately nothing. The Battle of the Somme will be a disaster for the British. It's a scar and one of the defining moments of British military history. Ultimately, the offensive will be called off. Joseph Joffre would be blamed, and he'd be replaced by Robert Nivelle, who himself would launch a failed offensive, leading to mutinies. he would be replaced by Philippe Pétain. Ultimately, Philippe Pétain would also be replaced as chief of staff by Ferdinand Foch. Both Foch and Pétain would take up defensive strategies, unlike their predecessors, and the casualties would continue, but not at the same rate. And this is just an ode to the single bloodiest battle, or one of the single bloodiest battles in history, the Battle of the Somme. Absolute mayhem. Frozen. But we are now a little bit northwest of Fayetteville. We're at Beaumont-Hamel, which is a tiny little French commune. Communes are like little villages to recognize the sacrifice made by an unsung hero in the war, a dominion and frankly region of the world that gets no attention almost. Newfoundland, despite what seems to be reality, was actually its own dominion. It wasn't part of Canada until 1949. It was granted semi-independentship in 1907. As such, during the Great War, it was its own self-governing entity within the British Empire. Now, Newfoundland is, of course, not very populous today. In 1914, 12,000 men would eventually serve in the Great War. And their defining moment was at the battle and capture of Beaumont-Hamel. We can see the scars of the land here. I refrain from showing too much, for I don't want to spoil it for any potential visitors. But one thing I just want to quickly recognize is the freezing temperatures of the French winter up in the north that I'm in right now, that these soldiers would have had to endure for 4 years if they were lucky, but it's not even lucky to have survived all 4 years. Mud from the constant rain that defines this part of France, freezing temperatures. It was hell to be on the front. Oh my God, I can't think of a single war more hellish than World War I. But this is just a quick ode to the Commonwealth again, specifically the men of Newfoundland, which at the time also comprised of Labrador on the mainland. But there goes the Newfoundland elk. I'm almost halfway between Clermont and Pont-Saint-Maxence, right in the heart of Oise, the department, when I stumbled across this cemetery. And luckily, it is all in French, but there was a description that I was it's freezing, able to decipher. And basically, if you look at a map of the Western Front, it was frozen for much of the war. But the Oise sector was particularly sort of calm, relatively, of course, relative to the area, let's say around, of course, Verdun or the Somme or Flanders. It was a relatively quiet period. In fact, the front line was situated for most of the war just sort of west of the city of Noyon. Might be pronouncing that wrong, Noyon. But basically, that was the situation. And then eventually in around 1917, I believe it was, the Germans retreat to try to get rid of a salient that was formed. A salient is kind of like a bulge, right? So you want to maintain a sort of like a straight front line instead of having to defend from three sides. So they retreat, a tactical retreat to kind of tighten up the front. And the Oise sector is pretty calm up until spring of 1918, when the Germans launched their last-ditch offensive, as I mentioned beforehand. And this is when Ferdinand Foch is at the helm, Supreme Allied Commander. He's sort of is brilliant with his use of the reserves and just totally peters out the German offensive. It's ultimately a failure, and it's sort of Germany's last breath, so to speak. But this cemetery is from the martyrs all across this department, so just across Oise. And as I mentioned, because it was a calm sector, they just simply, the casualties from this area aren't as high as the Somme or the area, let's say like Lorraine, which saw literally millions of deaths. But yeah, it's absolutely freezing. The countryside is beautiful, but man, it's hard to believe how much absolute devastation and carnage was brought upon these beautiful lands. Onwards we go. We are at the battlefield, memorialized in Canadian history. We're at Vimy Ridge, right next to the little town of Vimy. It's extremely cold right now, but whereas we saw just east of Amiens, just one of the contributions of the Australians, that memorial commemorated John Monash and the Australians who fought in the Battle of Amiens. But almost 500,000 Australians would fight in the war. Meanwhile, the Canadians would mobilize over 1 million men for the war effort. The Canadian who's probably most famous in the war is Arthur Currie. But Arthur Currie was not the commander at Vimy Ridge. In fact, a Brit was the commander of the Canadians at Vimy Ridge. Of course, Canada being a dominion of the British Empire. Julian Byng was his name. Basically, after disastrous defeats and mass casualties from the Battle of the Somme, from mixed results from the Greek front at Salonika, and Joseph Joffre, despite popular success and the people loving him, was sort of pushed aside, and a new chief of staff of the French army was assigned, Robert Nivelle. Well, Robert Nivelle would initiate the so-called Nivelle offensive, in which the salient that formed between Arras and Champagne, a sort of bulge formed in the front line after the First Battle of Aisne, the Aisne River. The idea was to attack on both ends of this bulge, first towards Arras and then on the Aisne River to the south. The French would take over the Aisne sector, and the British and their dominions would take over the Arras sector. Well, to help get the pressure off the French, the British would attack at Arras with their dominions. And the opening phase of the fight in Nivelle's offensive was led by the Canadians. The Canadians attacked the so-called Vimy Ridge, 100,000 of them, and were successful. The Germans were driven back, but along the rest of the front, the rest of the Nivelle offensive was a failure. The French at the Aisne River were absolutely torn apart. and the British didn't fare all that much better. But Julian Byng and his Canadians proved heroic, and despite their success, Robert Nivelle would soon be replaced by Philippe Pétain. For mutinies began to emerge as the French troops realized that they're just being thrown in front of machine guns and being killed for no apparent reason. But this is just an ode to not just the Canadians of Vimy Ridge, but of all Canadians and all Commonwealth men who fought in the Great War. I'm somewhere that I did not thought I would be in. I'm in Belgium. I crossed the border spontaneously, realized that I have to visit the Ypres Salient, as it was so called. Just give a brief overview. Belgium, or what today is known as Belgium, was part of Spain since around the 1500s. Well, after the War of Spanish Succession, it was given to the Austrians alongside Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and Milan. During the French Revolutionary Wars, when Napoleon was just before he had taken control under the Directory, as it was called, the French Revolutionary armies invaded the Austrian Netherlands and annexed them. After the Napoleonic Wars were over, the lands of today's Belgium were given to the Netherlands. The Netherlands became this enlarged kingdom and served as a buffer state, in a way, between France and Prussia. Well, unlike their Dutch Protestant selves, the southern, soon to be called Belgians, were Catholic. And given the liberal atmosphere and national determination, the Catholic Flemish and Wallonians revolted in 1830, and with international support, they created their own nation, the Kingdom of Belgium. Soon the Treaty of London would be signed by the major powers, guaranteeing Belgian neutrality, and Belgium would become a buffer state. And Belgium would soon industrialize with many plentiful natural resources, and it would become relatively powerful given its size. And unfortunately, in World War I, it was in the sort of crossroads of the German armies. The Germans, the outbreak of the war demanded the Belgians to allow them to pass through. Belgium refused. Germany invaded nevertheless, but the Belgians gave them a good fight. So much so that they allowed for the British Expeditionary Force to arrive at Mons, or as you say it in French, I believe it's pronounced Mon, but they arrived and sort of delayed the German advance as much as they could. The Belgians would mobilize a couple 100,000 men and would prove to be a useful and effective fighting force. After the Battle of the Marne and the Battle of the Aisne River, the Race to the Sea, as it was called, occurred, where the Allied and German armies attempted to outflank each other, going ever so north. Well, eventually the front would stabilize in the Ypres Salient, as it was called, resulting in the first battle of the Ypres. Ypres is a city right here, and we're just east of it. Well, the Flanders sector, as it would be called, or the Ypres Salient, would be characterized by mud and harsh weather, and would be a stalemate the entire war, effectively. There'd be 5 battles fought here, all for nothing, and at the end of the day, over 1 million casualties would be the result. The Second Battle of Ypres in 1915 would see the first time the Germans deploy poison gas on a mass scale. And World War I's, of course, infamous for that. In the Third Battle of the Ypres, or so-called Passchendaele, is famous among Canadians especially for one of the few true successes of that battle, of that engagement, was Arthur Currie's Canadian Corps taking the little town of Passchendaele, which I am just by. It's right there, Passchendaele. The so-called Fourth Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Lille, and the Fifth Battle of Ypres would just be slogs, just casualties and deaths. But I've stumbled across a monument to Commonwealth soldiers. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, of course the United Kingdom, Scotland, South Africa. And then you have the Belgian, and then you have further down the Flemish flag, the EU flag. This is a monument. Passchendaele, 4 miles to the north. Australia, 10,000 miles that way. Aotearoa, the Maori name for New Zealand. Newfoundland, Canada, Scotland. And South Africa. Canada as well, there you go. It's a shame they don't mention Ireland. The Irish would be crushed in the Easter Rising, yet 200,000 of them would fight and die on the front for an empire that despised them. Really disgusting entity that is Northern Ireland, but that's for another story. You have the Springbok from South Africa. You have the Scottish bagpipes. Just an ode to the Commonwealth and an ode to the Belgian front at Ypres. I'm somewhere beautiful, but with an incredibly dark past. In 1917, the Russian Revolution is well on its way. We have the February Revolution and the so-called Kerensky provisional governments established after the Tsars are overthrown. Tsar Nicholas II. Well, the war continues during that period with Kerensky at the helm of Russia. Immense defeats are suffered. The Russians lose millions of men, and the Russians want peace at whatever cost. And that ultimately leads to deteriorating conditions, leading to the October Revolution, at which point Lenin takes control, and we have the beginning of the Russian Civil War between the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and the Whites, the Tsarists. Well, with Lenin at the helm and in control of the rich western parts of Russia, including Moscow and soon to be named Leningrad, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans, awarding them Belarus, Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, immense swaths of territory, but again, whatever cost, in order to make peace. Well, as a result, the Germans did not have to fight on the east anymore. Same with the Austro-Hungarians. So in 1917, after the October Revolution and peace, the Germans have millions of men to be sent westwards to fight France, who is reeling after 3 years of war. And this is also around the same time as the American entry into the war. Well, the Germans realized that the Americans and their resources cannot be matched, even by the might of Germany. And so they need to launch an offensive before anything happens, before the Americans can come in numbers. Well, the Germans shift their armies and launch the Spring Offensive of 1918. Last-ditch attempt to break through and take Paris and knock France of the war and deprive Britain of its will to fight. The Germans push through, they capture Soissons, They are pushing at the gates of Chateau Thierry and right at the Marne, pushing up to the Marne River, taking up all the territory between the Aisne and the Marne. Well, the Americans are just slowly starting to arrive. The so-called American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, under Pershing, John Pershing. If you're from LA, Pershing Square, named after him. Well, the courageous Marines and other American troops held these woods by the name of Belleau Wood. And they fought the Germans despite relentless assaults. They fought heroically, and they managed to clear the area of enemy troops and totally defeated the Germans in this sector, and would ultimately allow for the larger French armies to thwart the German offensive. And that sort of last attempt, the sort of last big draw of air for the Germans, is put down and would soon lead to the signing of the Armistice. Absolutely incredible. When people talk of the British Empire in World War I, as if all those men came from Great Britain and Ireland, this could not have been further from the truth. The British Empire at the time was made up of a bunch of different entities called dominions. And dominions were basically these sort of self-governing colonies in a way. Their foreign affairs would be conducted from London, but administrative affairs would be conducted at home. This was the case for Canada, Newfoundland, Australia, South Africa, India, New Zealand. And these men sent soldiers to fight the war. In the Pacific, New Zealand and Australian troops took the German colonies. In Africa, South African troops took Tanzania and Namibia. In the Western Front, Canadian, Newfoundland troops were all sent. Against the Ottomans, Indian troops were sent into Mesopotamia. And it would be almost 2 million men that would end up fighting from the Commonwealth, from the Empire, for the British, on behalf of the British. And right now, we are on the battlefield of the Battle of Amiens. Amiens lies right there, to the west. I stayed there the night. It's a pretty decent town. And it's the largest town in Picardie, I believe. And as you see, we're on a hill. Well, the Germans, after their failed spring offensive, after the collapse of the Russian armies and the withdrawal of Russia from the war, the Germans amassed a huge army and launched their last-ditch attempt to break the will of the Allies before the Americans can come into the war in force. Well, despite making the greatest advance since the Battle of the Marne, it would not be the victory they hoped for. Eventually, German troops were exhausted and they halted their advance, the Allies. Well, part of the next step for the Allies was to counterattack. The Germans were tired. The Germans were exhausted and drained. And so, under the leadership of Henry Rawlinson, a British army with the British Corps, a Canadian Corps under John Monash, and that's actually where we're at. We're at John Monash's memorial site with all these Commonwealth soldiers buried here. There was the Canadian Corps under Arthur Currie, who was the most famous Canadian commander of the First World War. And so the British, alongside their Australian and Canadian comrades, fought the Germans and were successful at the Battle of Amiens, which would begin the 100 Days Offensive, which would directly lead to the Armistice signing. Its success would lead to it, I should say. It's staggering that imagine you're in Canberra, imagine you're in Wellington, imagine you're in Ottawa, imagine you're in Johannesburg, and events in Europe call you to war. And just like that, sons, fathers, uncles, nephews are sent to the bloodbath that was the Western Front. It's truly tragic, but that was the toll of modern war. We're gonna keep on moving. I've made a unplanned excursion. I was in the town of Valenciennes, to the sort of southeast of Lille in the Nord department. We are now in Nord-Pas-de-Calais. We are not in Picardie. And I almost just slipped. But basically, I was on the way to Maubeuge when I saw there was a sign that said fortified city, Ville fortifiée, something like that. And for a town called Les Quesnoy, or Les Quesnoy, I don't remember exactly. And so I'm like, okay, I'll go. Worst case scenario, it's not that bad, and I've wasted 20 minutes. But I'm so glad I came. I found out that I saw that there was a street called Rue Nouvelle-Zélande. I'm like, that's interesting. Why would this random town in middle of seemingly nowhere have a street named after it? All of a sudden I see George V, who was the British king at the time. Rue George V. I searched it up, and it was the New Zealanders who actually liberated this town from the Germans under the command of Major General Andrew Russell. Basically, the New Zealanders managed to liberate the city, scale these walls right here, the medieval walls, and just like that, another part of France was liberated in the so-called 100 Days Offensive, and that would culminate in the Armistice signing. Now, as a quick ode to New Zealand soldiers, at the outbreak of the war, New Zealand's first tasks were taking over the German Pacific colonies alongside the Australians. That included Papua New Guinea, Samoa, and that was done pretty easily, actually. Some of them were done without any fighting because the Germans didn't even know war broke out. Of course, this is over 100 years ago. Well, and they did that alongside their Australian comrades. Well, soon, the so-called Anzac Division would be formed. The Anzac stands for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. And they would infamously be sent to battle in Gallipoli against the Ottomans as soon as the Ottomans joined. And they were given an impossible task. The Ottomans were entrenched on the beachheads, and they were massacred. Eventually, at Gallipoli, the Allied forces, the British and the French, alongside their Anzac Australian and New Zealander comrades, withdrew, and the Ottomans stood victorious in control of the Dardanelles. Video cut out, I ran out of memory, but basically back to it. I'm just northwest of Cambrai, the same Cambrai from the League of Cambrai, where that alliance was sort of formed in the 1500s anyways. Basically, so the Gallipoli campaign is an utter failure, and the Anzacs the Australian and the New Zealand forces are reorganized and sent to the Western Front after a brief stint against the Ottomans. And basically we see that they fight alongside their British allies, alongside the French, alongside other Dominion troops. They fight in around Ypres, which is in Belgium. We're not going to see that area on this trip. Hopefully if I go to Flanders I'll see that. But they really are famous for being kind of like supplementary troops. Of course, New Zealand, relative to the other belligerents, would only conscript a small army because of its small population, but still 100,000 New Zealanders would fight them. Pretty tall order from such a small nation. I love New Zealand and their sacrifices, and they've paid the ultimate price. But that's how it goes, unfortunately, with modern war. Once more, we find ourselves in the beautiful Picardie countryside. And I've been talking a lot about French soldiers, British soldiers, American soldiers, Belgian soldiers, frankly, Allied soldiers. And there's a reason, of course. That being that I am of an allied nation, but you have to understand that all of these nations saw mass conscription, and in times of mass conscription there is no choice, unless you're of course rich or of parents who are powerful. Then of course you're exempt, because that's unfortunately how it is in history and modern day as well. But this is a cemetery dedicated to the German soldiers. There are over 11,000 soldiers buried here. And you might be thinking, there's a German cemetery in France? Well, yeah. You have to realize that after the Second World War, right? The French and the Germans kind of had a reconciliation. Of course, the French helped nation build a new Germany, a non-militaristic Germany. But it's also important that it's understood that these men were just normal people, just like how the French soldiers were normal people, just like the Americans were normal, the British, the Russians. We're all normal people. It's always the common man, the average person that gets caught up in wars. It's never those who declare them who have to go fight them. Germany would mobilize the most men in World War I. Despite the Russians having a greater population, and despite the Western Front being fought on French lands, a combination of a high percentage of mobilization and Germany's high population meant that they'd mobilize the greatest army. Of course, that would be split between two fronts, but nevertheless still. I believe at the end they'd mobilize over 13 million men. I might be wrong, but that's off the top of my head, and that's frankly with all the information in this video off the top of my head. But my God. And Germany would ultimately pay the ultimate price beyond the millions of young men it died. Germany would be dismembered, its empire dissolved. Rightfully so. The German Empire consisted of peoples that were not German, because it was an empire, and an imperialist one at that. There were Danes that did not want to be a part of it. There were Poles. Of course, there were some French people in the conquered territories of Alsace-Lorraine. And it was dismembered, forced to pay reparations. But that humiliation is what would lead to the rise of right-wing politics in Germany, and ultimately fascism, ultimately Hitler, and ultimately the Second World War. That's why after the Second World War, they learned their lesson and did not impose such harsh terms on Germany, despite them committing greater crimes in the Second World War. So this is the ode not to the German Empire, because to hell with it, as so with the French, British, Russian, and colloquially spoken of American Empire. To hell with all empires, but just an ode to the common man who lost his life for nothing. We end our journey in the port city of Dunkirk, beside the great lighthouse that stands here. I'm just sort of southwest of the northern terminus of the front lines on the Western Front. The front would stretch from Ypres Salient to Flanders all the way down to Switzerland. Depending on where you were on the front line, you could experience a wide array of climates and topography. If you were in Flanders, you could experience mud and rain and fog. If you were in Picardie, you could experience great, huge rivers that would be used as defenses. If you were in Champagne or the Ardennes, grand forests. If you were in Alsace, you'd have the Vosges Mountains. But regardless of where you were in the front, what sector you were at, the only constancy was utter death and destruction. I talked a lot about Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Austria, what have you. Millions would die from those nations. But I didn't really talk about Serbia or Romania or Bulgaria or even Portugal or Japan. All the other belligerents. Some 50 countries were involved in World War I. It was the most global war at that point, up to that point. I believe a quarter of the Serb population will have been dead by the time the war ends. The Austrians will have lost their empire, as will have the Germans, the Russians, and the Ottomans. Britain and France will have been demographically scarred, economically bankrupted, and psychologically devastated. I guess, although America would have also paid the price in terms of men, America was the true victor if you were to look at it through the lens of the American government at the time. But unfortunately, despite the sacrifices made in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, basically conjured up by the Allied nations out for vengeance. I never even mentioned Italy's entrance into the war. The Italians, the French, the Belgians all wanted blood. And as such, Germany was subject to harsh conditions, which would then result in the rise of fascism, the rise of Hitler, and the Second World War. And the Second World War, unfortunately, will be even more cataclysmic. But we'll end it there in northern France. Just a quick ode to the men who died in World War I on the Western Front. See you on the next journey.